Everybody, welcome back to another episode of an Evolved Review. I'm your host, James Caleb Kitchens. I am joined today, as always, by my co host, the man who has watched literally every second of everything on WWE Network, Caleb Stovall. Caleb, welcome back.
Thanks for having me as always, and all of your intros and stuff like that.
I try to come up with a different one for you every week. And then
I want to know it's different, right?
exactly. And we have a guest on this week, very special guest. This man's had 16 years in the professional wrestling business. He is a senior official for Palmetto Championship Wrestling. He is a senior official for Viral Pro Wrestling. Welcome to the show, Chris Wiggins.
Thanks, guys, for having me. It's going to be interesting because I'm going to be saying Caleb and Caleb, so I think I'm going to have to go Stovall and Kitchens, so that way I don't get everybody confused.
Well, it's like we're back in Flatline and stuff like that.
Right. So. When the video comes out, it'll actually have our names under our windows and everything, so people will be able to keep up with it fine. So today we got a very important episode, very significant episode in the history of pro wrestling, and we're talking about the Montreal Screwjob. So this is we're talking about the Dark Side of the Ring coverage of Montreal Screwjob. We're going to expand on that a bit, but if you haven't seen the Dark Side of the Ring episode, you can catch that on Google Play, YouTube, Hulu, and various other places where you can catch Dark Side of the Ring. So if you haven't seen the episode, definitely go check it out, and then come back and check out our review of it. You'll definitely get a lot more out of this if you've actually seen the episode. So, before we get started here, this one's narrated by Dutch Mantell. I want to get everybody's kind of just brief overall thoughts on this episode and what their coverage of it. Let's start with you, Chris, since you're the guest. That's tradition.
So this is definitely the most recent perspective of the actual Montreal Screwjob. And let's be honest, I mean, this came out mid 2019 roughly, and so this happened in '97. Since then, WWE decided that they would make men's with Bret Hart. Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart have made men's. Through tons and tons of shoot interviews, we've heard different perspectives. This is probably the first time that we've seen more of a cinematic style to kind of reenact some of the situations and maybe get more of a perspective that's cooled down. I really enjoy it because not many perspectives have gotten Jim Cornette. And I think Jim Cornette is a historian of pro wrestling. So he's been able to give different perspectives of it. We've seen a more calmer, cooler, collective Bret Hart in this situation. And we've seen a couple other wrestlers give their perspective. I believe this is probably the first time, other than his podcast, that Pritchard's come in. So it's definitely given more of a, I think, calmer, cooler, not so scripted perspective of the Montreal Screwjob versus the WWE version, or somebody else's perspective that's given out that information just to make the buck.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely always interesting with any topic that WWE is involved in to get it out of their spotlight, because they're always going to have their spin on it. And I think Dark Side of the Ring's done that with a few different things. What about you, Caleb? What was your thoughts on this?
Well, it's definitely one of the more, happier Dark Side of the Rings that we've covered on this one. It's interesting because, like Chris said, what I did was, I watched the Dark Side of the Ring, and then I watched some of the stuff on the WWE Network from the Monday Night War series that talked about the Heart of War, Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart rivalry and stuff like that, which obviously this pretty much culminates that rivalry and everything like that. It's so funny because if you talk to a non-wrestling fan, right? If you just knew people, like if you just know someone who knows about wrestling but doesn't really know about wrestling, and you were to show them this particular part of history in wrestling, they would just be like, "What is this? Like this doesn't make any sense." Like the idea of it to me is just so fascinating, because on one hand you feel for Bret Hart, but then on another level you kind of feel like, well, dude, you might be taking this a little bit too seriously, like you're about to go to another company and make a lot more money. So like, what really is the problem and stuff like that. Like I said, I love the fact that Dark Side of the Ring was able to get more views on it than just WWE's version. Because let's face it, this is the type of thing WWE would not really even address, a lot of the times. Or if they did, they would just be like, ha ha, that's a funny part in history, kind of like they did with the Brawl for All, even. Like just kind of that's just a botch in history. But instead, it made such a big, shockwave that it was like, no, we have to address this. Like we can't hide this and
Right.
everything. So it's interesting to see both sides to it and everything. And to be quite honest, I had a lot of questions going into it, and now I'm left with even more questions, to be quite honest of it. Like it's just that one type of thing of like, we just will never know the full side of this story.
Yeah. You mentioned that this is one of the brighter episodes of Dark Side of the Ring. Like no one died, right? So that definitely puts it above like half of them. And you and I coming out of the last two episodes, which were the Benoit episodes, which were really heavy. I'm
Yeah.
definitely looking forward to something that we can talk about, with a little bit less of a weight on us. So yeah, I mean, this was a monumental event in wrestling. So let's talk about, let's go back to the beginning and talk about how this came about. So Stampede Wrestling, right? I always knew about Stampede. I knew that it was a bunch of, Canadian guys, and it was a bunch of people that were more, not the giant, muscly, folks from WWE. It wasn't your huge bodybuilders all the time, and that, it was formed by Stu Hart. When I started looking into it, I mean, so their first run was from 1948 to 1984. And that's insane. I mean, if you thought about it today, like if you thought of a territory in terms of like an indie promotion, right? Imagine an indie promotion that ran for 40 years. That just doesn't happen. And then so they had a second run in 1985, and then they, were trying to get it back off the ground, and then finally they ran from uh, 99 to 2008, so they had a comeback after all this happened. Um, but so WWE kind of makes a deal to acquire them, and then they end up bringing in um, Bret Hart, who is kind of this rising star in professional wrestling. Um, so, Caleb, what did the Hart family kind of mean to you, when you were growing up?
Well, it's interesting because Bret Hart was really one of the first people I was introduced to when it came to pro wrestling. My father, Matt Stovall, um, I guess when I discovered wrestling, he was watching it one day and stuff like that. And as time went on, he would tell me two things. He would say, Sting is the best in WCW and Bret Hart is the best in WWF. That was what he said. So I kind of, I basically went with that, and I became a fan of Bret Hart as a child, just because of that and stuff like that. I didn't really realize why Bret was so good until like the later years when I really started to understand professional wrestling, the art of storytelling, the art of putting together matches and stuff like that. And Bret Hart, God, he's so good. Like you watch his matches, everything he does. Everyone says it might be cliche at this point, but it really is true. Like everything he did meant something. He didn't do a move just to do a move to pop the fans or something like that. He always looked at his matches like a legit wrestling match. And I think that really shows what the Hart family really instilled in him and everything like that, like what his father instilled in him. And then when I really got familiar with the Hart family was when Wrestling with Shadows came out, and the line I took from it was all of the sisters are married to wrestlers, and all of the brothers are like. So I can't remember exactly. I screwed that up, but Chris probably know what I'm talking about. But yeah, that's and I would see like the stories of Stu Hart, taking the people and like literally stretching them out. Like that is the definition of stretching someone out to really see if they can take it. And stuff like that. So they seem like they were no nonsense kind of like when it came to wrestling. Like it's like okay, well you either want to do this or you don't want to do this kind of thing. And I think that's what they mean. And look at the people that they've trained and stuff like that. We mentioned Chris Benoit and Chris Jericho and Lance Storm even. So just to name a few. So they have a huge history in the pro wrestling world.
Yeah, and I mean, going back to Sting in WCW, Bret Hart in WWF, the fact that both of them use the same finish is interesting there. Um, so I mean, and there definitely was a point in time where they both were essentially carrying their respective companies. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Chris, what did kind of Stampede Wrestling, the Hart family? What did that mean to you? When you first were introduced to either or both of them?
So I never really watched any of the Stampede stuff growing up. It wasn't readily available for me until later in life when I began studying for pro wrestling and tape studying. Is when I started kind of catching on to more of the information that was coming out from the Stampede era. I knew the family from the WWF perspective. I believe that Stu Hart was put on a pedestal by the McMahon family for a huge reason. It was probably one of the early developmental territories for WWE without actually being a developmental territory. Um, there was so much talent that would either start out in the Stampede Pro Wrestling or that they would come to WWF, WWE, and this probably even goes back to Vince Sr., to where they would use those guys, and once they ran out of the territory in the Northeast, they would send them to Canada, and then essentially, Stu would send them from Canada to either Puerto Rico or to Japan. So, as growing up a third generation wrestling fan, the British Bulldogs and the Hart Foundation and Bad News Brown were some of the guys that I grew up watching. My dad was like, this guy right here with Jimmy Hart and Anvil the Neidhart is going to be probably the best wrestler of the 90s. He's like, I bet the bottom, like, look at this guy. I mean, he's in good shape. He's conditioned. The only thing he lacks is a little bit of talent when it comes to mic skills. So I watched him a lot as I grew up and got into independent wrestling. One thing I realized in my era, and especially in the territory that I was working in, a lot of the guys wore the same gear. It was all black and red and stuff like that. So I took my character and said, how do I stand out? Well, I got to stand out by being a flamboyant color. I'm not Shawn Michaels. I didn't like Shawn Michaels. I didn't care for the Shawn Michaels attitude. I wasn't Coco Beware either, so I wasn't going to be wearing those kind of colors. So I went with the pink and the black, and I figured what other color that is completely on the other scheme of colors is pink. So I really took my whole look based off of Bret Hart. And I even loved doing his moves. I loved, doing a flying forearm off the middle rope. I loved doing a lot of different things that he did. I try to perfect them into those perspectives because I felt, just as you were saying, Caleb, every move he made meant something. There was no wasted move. My favorite move that he did not do, he took, was the sternum first into the turnbuckle. And he just took it so hard. And the ring, the sound the WWF ring made when he hit that turnbuckle just made you think he cracked the sternum. Yes. And I was terrified to ever take that move. So I took it a handful of times, but he was just, it was the fact that he was so confident in what he was doing and learning, getting into the business, learning how professional he was and how much he cared about the business, which just meant so much to many people. And then coming and finding out, that everybody in the Hart Foundation wasn't just a group of guys that got together. They were all family. You had the British Bulldog who was married into the family. You had Neidhart that was married into the family. You had the Pillmans who grew up in that area. So, I mean, Pillman was trained by a lot of those guys up there, and they all ran together. I mean, there's probably nobody in the wrestling business in the 70s and 80s that did not go to Stampede or did not come across the paths of any of those guys, Dynamite Kid, and have some type of influence on him. I mean, we talked about Sting and Bret Hart having the same move. That was something that they were both taught, from Japan. So that's kind of where the move came from. So,
right.
There's just so much that came from Canada in that territory, from that family. And I think a lot of people don't quite remember how well that family was and why they're one of the major families of professional wrestling, besides the McMahon family or the Rhodes or Guerreros. I mean, everybody has some sort of territory. I mean, they were the biggest ones. They were the well-known Canada family. I mean, it just, they produced so much, and they were really good about trying to execute and making sure that the psychology was being told and being taught.
Yeah, and then, I mean, there's a lot of the greats came out of the dungeon. One of the ones that always strikes me as being kind of like out of left field is a lot of people don't know Mark Henry actually trained with Stu Hart. When he was
Yep.
making the transition from Olympic wrestling to pro wrestling, I'm sure WWE probably had some hand in that in making that happen. Um, and why wouldn't they? Because it's like, hey, you send somebody to Stu Hart, they're either going to quit or they're going to be one of the greats. That's odds are. So I think as far as legendary wrestling trainers, he's probably right there. And yeah, I mean, Bret Hart was kind of the consummate professional wrestler. I mean, the guy everywhere that he went, especially when he came through that curtain, I mean, he was just on, and he was, sort of that. I mean, granted, I don't think his character was necessarily his exact personality, but we talk about this all the time. Of it was like their base personality just kind of amped up, and I think he was that. I think that he was a star. He took it seriously when he was the champion. He took that seriously. He was the champion to him. Uh, and Bruce Pritchard talks about that a little bit in the episode. Is he was the champion, and he did take that incredibly seriously, and that's something that you want as a booker, promoter, or whatever. When you put the championship on someone, you want them to be a champion. And I think Bret Hart definitely did that. So Bret Hart comes into WWF at the time, and they ended up taking the belt off of Ric Flair, which, I mean, anytime you decide to do that, I mean, he did have some health complications, but you're being asked to carry the torch from Ric Flair. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
Um, so they talk a little bit about that in the episode. Um, so let's kind of switch gears a second and talk about the other person that's involved in this heavily, which is Shawn Michaels. Which they obviously didn't get him to speak on this. Um, I don't know if WWE would have allowed it if Shawn did want to do it. We'll never know the answer to that one. But so kind of Shawn's kind of journey here. They kind of started off talking about the curtain call. Um, so the curtain call, of course, being Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, Shawn Michaels, Triple H, basically all coming out to the ring as Scott Hall and Kevin Nash um, went off to WCW. Chris, what did you think about this event? Did you see this live when it happened, or did you hear about it later?
I heard about it years later, when I started, questioning where, the click logo came from, where the hand signal from the, NWO guys, and just kind of curiosity. And my my perspective of this is, if you get Scott Hall's take on it from the actual dark side of the ring, he says like, well, the fans loved it. The fans loved it. And that's what we were looking at this being like 95, 96, right? And I don't understand how his perspective is saying the fans loved it, because when he transitioned over to WCW during this time frame and they formed the NWO, people were legitimately thinking that these guys were being sent from Vince to WCW to take over, WCW. And even to the point to where we had to do some cease and desist orders, that the characters were too much alike. I think that it was honestly the time frame for Shawn Michaels, knowing at that time, was a very hard individual to work with. Very immature, unprofessional, charismatic, one of the best wrestlers, athletic human beings in WWF of all time, especially during that time frame where a lot of the guys were really big. They were doing a lot of the same stuff, and he was coming out and doing more athletic, agile moves, taking more risk. So he was standing out in that perspective. However, when he didn't get his way, Shawn would lose his smile. He would pack his bag up. He would take his ball. He would run. One of my biggest things, and this is a turning point of me not liking Shawn Michaels, was a time frame later in his career where he got hurt and was not able to compete anymore, but just flies right over to Japan and does a whole bunch of different things in Japan. One of the biggest things that came out in the States was he was a special guest referee for FMW.
Yep.
And it was just like, you're supposed to be hurt. You're not supposed to be able to compete anymore. How are you just doing all these different things really quick? And a lot of people talk about that. I can't deny the athletic ability, the character, but in my opinion, I think that Vince saw something of saying, "Hey, we got to do something different, and we're just going to let him go do whatever he wants to do because he's so young." Like there was a decent age difference between Brett and Shawn at this time. I had quick math. Like Brett was almost 40 when the screw job happened. I don't know what age Shawn Michaels was, but I imagined it's 5-10 years maybe. Who knows? But there's an age difference there. There was an athletic difference there, and Shawn Michaels just was the future of WWF if there was going to be a future. I didn't like the fact that they broke the wall down, the barrier. Later on, we end up seeing that ended up being a great thing for the business to a certain degree, but probably a good thing for WWF and not so much for the wrestling business as a whole.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the short term implications of it, when I say short term, I mean over the next probably 5-10 years, I think it was incredibly lucrative. But, 20 years later, I don't know if we can maybe say the same thing. If you look at ratings during the Monday Night Wars and Attitude Era versus today. Caleb, what did you think about the curtain call and kind of how this came about?
Well, it's funny because for many years I didn't understand it. I didn't understand what was the big deal about it. And then when I got more stories about it and stuff like that, I was like, oh, okay, I see what they did and everything like that and why everyone was pissed off. It's funny though, because if you look at that incident, you wonder, let's say they hadn't have done that, right? Let's say they had never come out. Would the business be where it is right now? Because you got to think about it. Not only did, Triple H, he was the one that got punished. He was supposed to win the King of the Ring, and he was probably going to go on to WrestleMania that year or something like that, and he was going to get this big, huge push. And instead, that didn't happen, and we got Stone Cold Steve Austin. So you look at that curtain call, and you go, well, you could say that well, it exposed the business or it did this and everything. But had it not happened, you'd have never seen the rise of Stone Cold Steve Austin. you'd have never seen the start of even the Attitude Era, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I agree. And so this is something I didn't really cover in the episode. So we're moving towards this whole title situation, right? In the episode, they almost make it seem like Brett got the championship off of Flair and then held it until he dropped it to Shawn at Survivor Series. But we know that's not the case. Um, so they, the first time that the title would change hands between these two guys, as we all know, is WrestleMania 12 with the infamous Iron Man match. And something that I didn't know until I started researching this topic is that WWF actually took Shawn off the road and gave him time to train for this. They were like, "Yeah, you got like 2 months to just condition yourself." While Bret Hart and for many years I've been 100% on Shawn Michaels' side in this whole thing, and a lot of this stuff has definitely changed that perspective for me. Um, yeah, so they take Shawn off the road. And they're like, "Yeah, man, you got like 2 months, just train." And then Bret Hart is out here, wrestling Yokozuna and all these other guys, you know, and working a full schedule basically. Um, so I mean that to me, makes it look like, even further that the WWF was trying to kind of make Shawn look fantastic, and then Brett's just kind of this like workhorse, and they're trying to get the last that they can out of him before they just kind of toss him aside. Caleb, what do you think about that?
Well, it's funny because I agree with Brett that like around this time he was having some of his best matches at this time. I mean, that match that he had with and this just goes to show you how good he was. I mean, he had a match that was good with Diesel. That was it's one of my favorite Bret Hart matches. And how many people can say that they had a good match with Diesel? I mean, let's be honest. um, but yeah, he was having some of his best matches, and I did not know that either. That Shawn Michaels was basically off the road for 2 months and stuff like that, because you would still see him on Monday Night Raw every single night. You would still hear from him and stuff like that. So that never crossed my mind. Yeah, I can see where Brett might get a little bit pissed, where he's just like, "Hey man, I'm going out here having these awesome matches, drawing these houses and stuff like that, and yeah, here's your belt, kind of thing." But I guess at the same time, I also just kind of see it like okay, well, I get to go, I get to have my time off after this, kind of thing. So yeah, I'll go and bust my ass for a little bit. Then yeah, here, you take the belt for a little bit. I'm gonna go home and relax and make money, kind of thing. So I don't know. There's different ways that you can look at it. But I want to go back to something real quick. Was yeah, just at this time, Shawn Michaels. I mean, let's face it, he was just a huge prick. I mean, Jim Cornette even says that he's like Shawn Michaels is one of the greatest of all times, but he was a fucking prick.
Yeah, I mean that sums up Shawn Michaels pretty nicely. Yeah, and so they've got Brett working a full time schedule.
Mm-hmm.
And Bret Hart is quoted, pulled up a quote here from him saying, "They wanted Shawn to be scraping me up off the mat, but I think I was ultimately the one that ended up scraping him off the mat." And he talks about how, they filmed Michaels like working with his trainer, Jose Lothario, famous Lucha Libre performer. And then, they showed like Bret Hart jogging in Calgary and then getting stretched by his dad. In
What
the
about
build up for that.
the infamous swimming pool? I mean,
I was about to say that one.
Everything in the build up for WrestleMania. I mean, that WrestleMania was one I only got as a child, and even as a teenager. I only was able to rent the big four, pay-per-views: the Royal Rumble, WrestleMania, SummerSlam and Survivor Series. So watching Royal Rumble and then getting in to, and I believe so. This was '96, if I remember correct.
Correct.
Okay, so this was a huge Royal Rumble that we had. Vader made a big debut. Shawn, this was big Shawn comeback kind of deal. He wins. We go to Iron Man match, and the the video packages that we were set up with going into WrestleMania for Bret Hart, extremely slow. The music was very boring. We watch, as you said, watch him running on the side of the road. He's down in the dungeon. He's at his house swimming. They show him swim a couple laps. He pops up. He does a little interview. We actually see some of that footage in the Wrestling with Shadows. But we have this high, intense video package every week with Shawn Michaels training, doing sit-ups upside down, and doing all this acrobatic stuff. So they pumped up Shawn Michaels to being this extremely young athlete, and walking in, you had no other choice unless you were a diehard Bret Hart fan, believing that Bret Hart was going to lose. They turned the tables and turned the investment, which in retrospect, looking at this as a performer, you're going to get bitter. You're going to get upset. And being pulled, you're working. Bret Hart used to go to India and the streets, just Bret Hart alone, not WWF. Bret Hart alone, and the streets would be slammed full of people. I mean, it was like he was a pop star every culture across the world during this time frame as he was a champion.
He was all taken over there.
Exactly. So Bret Hart constantly on the road, Shawn Michaels being able to heal up, and for Bret to be a champion during the time frame where they're running house shows, where the house show market is starting to come up a little bit. It's reasonable at that time. Nothing compared to what we're seeing these days. To work the shows, to do the tapings, and then have to go do a 60-minute Iron Man match, the very first Iron Man match on WrestleMania, there's no telling what kind of conditioning Bret was actually going into that. And to let Shawn Michaels just sit at home, not say he's sitting at home doing nothing, but there's a different lifestyle when you're on the road and you're working 5 days a week, twice on Sundays in some aspects, and then having to go into a match like this. The conditioning levels were in two different areas. The perspective that they were showing on television was in two different areas, and I don't think that they truly respected Bret Hart as a champion. And it's upsetting to sit here and watch one of his runs to be kind of tarnished. And even in the second run, when they actually, get the belt back on him and we're going in to Survivor Series, that's the retrospective of Bret Hart being upset. And there's tons of wrestlers that will go and talk unbelievable amount of information on Bret Hart, just saying he was a whiner, he took the business too seriously. I think when you're brought up in professional wrestling the way he was brought up, we've always said it, there's a joke that runs around. You have the map of the world and you sit there and you watch it and you look at it and say, Canada is this type of wrestling, Mexico's lucha libre, Japan strong style. It's all respected everywhere you go. It's traditionally looked at as a real sport or as a legitimate form of entertainment. And then you get to the States and it's a joke. Like, oh, you're a wrestling fan? It's a joke. That's the way I think people are looking at Bret Hart. He was like, hey, not only am I a wrestling champion, but I'm the guy. I'm the top guy. I'm the guy who is on the main event, who people are seeing first and are saying, I'm going to buy this ticket based off of him being there. And I think he took his job seriously. And people to discredit him for how serious he took his job, I think is a little upsetting. And I think that's what makes Bret Hart a little bitter when he goes to do some of these interviews now.
Especially when he was raised. I mean, his whole life was wrestling. I mean, with him coming from the Hart family. I want to touch on the swimming pool. This came to mind when you guys mentioned it about Bret having the swimming pool in his house. If you've read Edge's book, Adam Copeland on Edge, there's like half a chapter that he spends talking about how impressed he was that Bret Hart had a heated swimming pool inside his house. I don't know why that just came back to me, but
well, I want to bring this up real quick, because I also feel as though, in ways you could also look at this from a booking standpoint, right? You have Bret Hart do all of these matches, right? And then you have Shawn Michaels, take off or whatnot to get ready for the main event, blah, blah, blah. And then Brett goes away. Sean carries the load. And, originally, I'm pretty sure, even Bruce Pritchard has even said this, the next WrestleMania, they had already penciled Brett and Sean in for that main event. And in ways you could look at it as Brett kind of might not have seen that picture, or maybe he did, kind of thing. I don't know. But I understand, people saying, well, I guess I don't really understand, because I think he did take the business seriously, which is a good thing. I just think at times, maybe someone didn't communicate where they were going with him or something like that, and maybe that what he had been pissed off about so much too.
I mean,
If I'm speaking.
that's possible. I mean, that happens a lot, with talent in general, or just with life in general, where there's like a
Right.
communication barrier or something like that. And from what it sounds like, I don't think Vincent Mann had a really good line of communication with Brett based on these interviews.
Yeah, and he might not have, but I was just saying, maybe that was like their plan and stuff like that. But hey, it is what it is.
So let's get into where some of our, let's get into the actual event here and kind of what led up to it. So, um, we start with kind of Bret Hart getting an offer from WCW. And Bret Hart, being the professional that he is, takes less money. He takes a pay bump, obviously, but he takes considerably less money than WCW was offering him. He goes to Vince McMahon and he says, "Hey, they've made me this offer. What can you do to keep me?" And Vince offers him, I believe the number that was quoted is 1.5 million a year. At that point in time, fantastic contract. Bret says, "All right, well, I mean, I've spent all this time here. I'm gonna be loyal to the company and I'm gonna stay." Um, and I think that was fantastic of him because a lot of people, we could say a lot of people wouldn't do that, but we don't have to do that because a lot of people didn't do that. A lot of people saw those big paychecks and took off. Um, so we've got that. So they're trying to figure out a way to get the title off of Bret Hart. Because he decides to stay with WWF. Things start to go kind of sideways as far as the ratings war goes, and Vincent Mann backs out on the contract. Um, I didn't know about this until the Dark Side of the Ring episode, and this was another one of those things that kind of swayed me away from being on Sean's side in all of this, because I've always had the mindset, based off of what I knew about this, of like, Bret Hart, just didn't want to lose on the way out. But there's so much more to it than that, and I think Vince going back on the contract is kind of the nail in the coffin for whether Bret Hart was right to do this or not. Um, and there's a lot of different opinions on that. So what do you guys think about Vince giving him the contract and then saying, "Hey, we can't pay you that amount just because he gets tied up in a ratings war with WCW."
I think it's I'm not surprised, and I've heard that before, so I knew about that, and I think that they addressed that in Wrestling with Shadows as well. Yeah, but here's my thing. Vince is painted in a bad light in that instance, and it's kind of like I think he wanted to keep Bret Hart. He didn't want him to go. And so he thought at the time, he's like, I can afford this. But then, as they're going into the Attitude Era, the Attitude Era hadn't really started yet. It was just leaning towards that and stuff like that. And they were still getting hammered at this time by WCW. I mean, I remember that there was a point in time period where I didn't watch a single episode of Raw because Nitro was so good at the time as a child. So, I just think that at the time he thought he could keep Bret, but then he realized, oh, well, I can't keep you. But I guess my question is, does that really necessarily make him that bad of a person in this instance? I mean, I think it's more of just and I'm not really defending anybody. I'm just more questioning of like, I mean, that doesn't really like to me. He didn't really do anything wrong. I think Brett took it that way. That he's like, well, at first you really wanted to keep me, now you really don't, kind of thing. So I can see Brett's side of it, but at the same time, I'm almost kind of like, I mean, I just think Vinny was, backed into a corner and he just couldn't get out of it. It was like, I mean, this is what it is. But that's just me.
Yeah. So quickly touching base on it, I think initially, they come to good terms, and I don't think that Brett. I think he's upset that he feels that there's probably loyalty that he should be owed in some aspects of how much work his family has put into WWF at the time, especially with him having family still there after he leaves. I mean, because we still had Owen there, we had Bruce Bulldog, we had Neidhart there at the time, and I think the relationship between Vince and Brett were more of a like a stepfather kind of perspective. So the money coming into play, I think at some point maybe Brett may come to an understanding, or something that's not being discussed at all is how much was Shawn Michaels going to get paid after this? How much of a pay jump was he going to get in on his secondary contract? And my question is this: is if you wanted Brett to be there so badly, or let's take that out of the question. If you wanted to keep the title in WWF and you wanted to treat Brett with some type of respect and dignity, because let's understand this, like the Canadian mentality of staying face is equivalent to the somewhat mentality of staying face in Japan, not here in the States. I mean, in the States, your retirement match, or if you're in your hometown, you're going to lose. That's almost inevitable from a booking perspective. But in some of these other countries, the idea of a character and how you're treated and the amount of respect that you have, especially in your hometown or home country of that aspect, plays a huge part. I think maybe a safer way, if they could not give Brett the amount of money he was asking for from WWF and they knew they couldn't do it, why not just give him an extension? Because at that point he had not signed with WCW. So I think maybe you give him an extension and you let him win at home and then drop the belt Monday night in whatever perspective they need and hold them on the books for another month, 6 months, whatever you needed to do. We weren't there. I don't know how the corporate side of the business was being ran at that time. So do I blame Vince for retracting his contract? I mean, we don't know the details of what was going on at that time. From a business perspective, as a guy who has book show and had to look at a roster page and look at how much this talent's going to cost me, you have to figure out who's worth it, who's not worth it. And I think at that time, especially from the WrestleMania from previous years there with the Iron Man match, I think the writing was on the walls that they were not expecting Brett to be the guy that was going to be the flagship of this company, and was probably going to go from a guy who was ultimately a main event guy to probably a mid-card guy due to age or even possibly the politics that was discussed in this docuseries here, that Shawn was going to come in and was going to do all these things with all his boys prior to the curtain call. What that could have happened down the road. I mean, we see that at Degeneration X was performed as how heavy they were on the show and how much room they were given, on what they could and could not do. It was pretty much what they could do, because there wasn't a whole bunch of what they could not do at that point. So I could any of that brought up? That's something that I have not heard from anybody, and I have constantly thought, who was in the room when Brett walked out and they started talking finances? Was it Cornette? Was it Shawn? How many different meetings were given to all these people? I mean, people who are not talked about in this are, Briscoe and Pat Patterson, who were definitely the left and right hand man of Vince for many, many years from a booking standpoint and from a business standpoint. Vince Russo, in my opinion, I don't think he had a lot to say when it came to who was getting hired and who was not getting hired. And I imagine we'll get into a little bit deeper as we go on in this, but I think that's probably something that should be thought of. But to put the heat on Vince for doing what he had to do, he's in charge of hundreds of people. And I think he did what was best for, not only for him, but for his business, his family. Whereas Brett is looking from just his perspective, which, he went to WCW anyways. And he made some pretty good guaranteed money while he was there. But, and even as a fan of Bret Hart at the time, I didn't take into consideration of Vince McMahon, which I think a lot of people don't take into consideration when they start making judgment calls on people. Is they don't look at the bigger picture. They're looking at a very small picture and the situation between two people, not necessarily through the whole company or through the whole industry in general.
And it's definitely easy in any situation to shit on Vince McMahon. He just kind of made himself, after this happened, he became that persona. Like, I am the evil, kind of corporate machine. And speaking of Jim Cornette, I think this is a good time to talk about, as Brett decides, I don't want to lose this to Sean, and I would be remiss if I didn't also mention Sean's comment to him in the locker room. Brett talks about when he says, I know we don't like each other, we've had all these issues. I'm gonna be a consummate professional out there in the ring. I would never do anything to, put you in danger, whatever, we're going to do business. And Sean says, well, I'm not going to do the same for you. That, to me, is like the ultimate when I hear that, just as somebody who's been in the business as long as I have, I just think that that's like the worst that you could possibly do from one, wrestler to another. But imagine how that had to sound to Bret Hart, who grew up in the professional wrestling business in his entire life, and so no, I don't blame him for feeling the way that he felt given that quote. In the WWF boardroom during this time, they're trying to figure out how we're going to get the title off this guy. So we've got the two different stories here. Jim Cornette gives this very credible, he's a wrestling historian. He reached back into the archives and found some, kind of incident, or he probably just remembered them off the top of his head, to be honest. He's familiar with these kind of double cross scenarios from different territories at the time, and pitches it to Vince. And then Vince Russo, of course, says, well, I just came up with it. you know, so I definitely want to talk about this. Chris, what do you think? So first of all, who do you believe out of the two of them, and what do you think about the Cornette pitching this or Vince Russo pitching this?
So if we're going to keep it to just these two guys, because in other documentaries, everybody has their say so. Oh, I did this and I did that. WWF version said Triple H is the one who came up and said, "Hey, if you're not going to do business, we'll do business for him." Yeah. And I think I call bullshit on that, because Triple H is the fall guy from previous year with the curtain call. Okay, do you really think that Triple H? I mean, at that time, he was nowhere near close to being with Stephanie and the McMahon family, and he's not in the relationship he's in at current times. So do you think that he honestly was in that room and pitched that idea? No. So we'll kick that scenario out. So let's just focus on these two guys here. Jim Cornette has done absolutely everything in professional wrestling. He understands the psychology from front to back, even if you don't agree with his opinion on everybody, which let me say this. When I broke into the business, I didn't know a lot. And there was a nice gentleman in Colombia that happened to be like a second generation wrestler. His father had ties with Moolah at WWF, and he was one of the many people that was a handler of the women wrestlers that were in and out of WWF. Okay. The first thing he told me, and this guy wasn't much older than I was, but he'd definitely been out of the business for a long time. Mr. Rick James told me, kid, if there's one thing you're going to learn about professional wrestling, life is a work. Okay. Everything around you is going to be worked some way, somehow. So I think the bad attitude that people give Jim Cornette, it is strictly Jim Cornette likes good publicity and bad publicity. He is constantly working people left and right, and I think people like to overlook him because of the negative things that he says, which I think at times is a work between him and some of the other people, regardless of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, what has Vince Russo done? We have nobody backing up the information that Vince Russo has put out there other than Vince Russo or Ed Ferrara, for which they both went to WCW and shat the bed. Neither one of them produced anything. In fact, they broke down the wall again in WCW with the crap that they pulled between Hogan and Jeff Jarrett at Bash at the Beach. The infamous Oklahoma character that Ed Ferrara did. So to sit there and to think that Vince Russo came up with this brilliant idea, because we also see it in the previous episode that you guys talked about, the Brawl for All being another crappy episode of Vince Russo's tales. Do I think that Vince Russo was the guy in the room that produced some of the edgier stuff, because he was probably the only guy in the room watching Jerry Springer or Maury Povich at the time doing all the different DNA tests out there? He brought that perspective, and you can see that perspective in some of the Goldust stuff that's out there, or stuff that would move on with the edgier stuff. I believe he produced that. But to have a sensible business mind, to be able to put two guys who are main event guys and say, well, you know what, this guy's brilliant, he made the business right here with that one. No, there's no way. Cornette was in every major promotion in the United States. He's done everything. Did Vince allow Vince Russo to go run one of his territories? Absolutely not. He never did. The best thing Vince Russo ever did was the acting parts in some of the Billionaire Ted stuff, which as a teenager or a child going to adolescence, I didn't even know he was there until 10 years later that he was in those films. I don't believe one bit that Vince Russo had anything to do with that. I think at that point, he probably went to Ed Ferrara afterwards and told Ed, we really hate Cornette, but he just came out with this brilliant idea on how to fuck somebody over. You know what I mean? And he didn't come up with that. It's something that's been in the business for many years. We saw it in Moolah do it to Wendy Richter. It's been done in tons and tons. Those are two infamous ones that have been brought up in modern times. But it's probably happened everywhere. I mean, it happened in shoot-style wrestling all the time. So, no. And I don't think Vince Russo knew anything about pro wrestling. And there's no way that he even knew about business. So, yeah, throw it in trash can, light it on fire, like Medusa did with the WWF Women's Championship.
I mean, just to add to that, for the Brawl for All, he watched the Brawl for All as they did the documentary and said he was totally entertained by it still.
And he's a hypocrite, because at the end he gets all upset about how, I wish I wouldn't have done that, but he's laughing when Bradshaw gets knocked out, and he's just like, I did it for Bradshaw to get knocked out. Stovall, you got to do the impersonation here. I haven't seen one, so you got to do one where he says, I did it for Bradshaw and I hoped you get knocked out.
Well, I'll be honest with you, bro. Watching this, I'm totally entertained by this. No, I would literally watch the Jerry Springer show and write Monday Night Raw. That was from his fucking mouth. That was from his mouth. I always thought that was exaggerated. I thought, okay, they might have taken some ideas. No, he literally says they were watching Jerry Springer while writing Raw. I'm just, oh my God.
Well, he took credit for the Attitude Era, and we know he wasn't the architect behind the moments that we all cherish from that time. He was the filler in between that stuff with, the wet T-shirt contest in the ring, and Lawler screaming puppies, and all this other nonsense.
Yeah, they had dude, I was watching Raw the other night and from the Attitude Era, and I saw the Brood versus the Ministry of Darkness, like 3 members of the Ministry of Darkness, and it was a bloodbath match. And it wasn't a first blood match. It was literally they had buckets of the red liquid, and you had to dump it on your opponent to become the.
The Henry O. Godwin, Triple H, hog pin match, those kind of things. I believe that definitely came from Vince Russo. And if you don't believe me, just watch WCW Time Frame from Nitro, and we'll have Juventud Guerrero that's in the Monday Night Wars, where they did the pinata on the pole match, or Judy Bagwell on a pole match, So, I mean, even when he went into TNA, later years from WCW, and he was in the early stages of TNA, and he brought in a group of guys, and they called themselves SEX, Sports Entertainment Extreme. It was just regurgitated ideas that he thought were going to work, and they ultimately did not work. To me, he was not a head coach, and he wasn't even like an offensive or a defensive coordinator. He was like a special teams coach, in my opinion. He was a guy that if you want to do some trick plays and do something funny or comical that didn't get made up by one of the boys, you would call him Vince Russo. We got 2 hours of time. We should bring in Vince Russo. They should probably bring him in now because they have 3 hours of television, and they need to find something to put in there besides all the replays that they use these days.
Yeah.
But I don't know if corporate would really like that. But
he couldn't get away with it with the PG rating. I mean, he just couldn't.
No, I will say this though. For whatever reason, though, Vince Russo and Vince McMahon worked together as a team. I mean, they did. Obviously Vince, is really the head of everything and all that. But just him, because Stone Cold Steve Austin has even said it in interviews that it would be Vince McMahon, Vince Russo, Pat Patterson, and Bruce Pritchard, I think, and they would just sit at Vince's poolside and they would write stories and stuff like that. And also Ed Ferrara, I think, at the time as well. I don't know. For whatever reason, they work. But here's why I've always said, though, Vince Russo is always full of shit and everything like that, is because you could tell what Vince was in charge of. Vince did not care about the mid card or the lower card. He cared about the main events. Like, he cared about the stuff with Austin, Rock, D-Generation X, and all that. He had a hand in all of that. But when it came to other stuff, like I said, you had on Monday Night Raw, a bloodbath match. You had all of this other stuff. That was just stuff where Vince was like, okay, well, I just need something there, so Vince, you write that.
Well, as the professional billionaire that Vince is, he still has this incredibly like childish, immature, sense of humor. So, Vince Russo just, scratched that itch for him. And, and Vince did what he does. He milked you and for all your ideas and everything that he thought you were worth. And then he tossed you. And I mean, and that's what Vince McMahon, that's his specialty.
We all have, when you hang out with a group of people, everybody's got that one guy in the group that will do something stupid when you're bored, and that's essentially, I feel that was Vince Russo. I mean, and to reiterate on what you were saying, Caleb, about Vince having this childish mentality. The first thing that comes to my mind was Vince Russo sitting there going, "Hey, there's this guy that want to be a wrestler, and he can throw up on command. We should totally bring this guy in. There's so many crazy things we could do with him." And he's like, "I love it." So then we fast forward to Beyond the Mat, and you get the infamous "he's gonna puke," and there's only one thing left to do, pal. Do you need some coffee? And you go from there. Which also goes to this, is that to buy into more Cornette, when he speaks of Vince, he uses the mannerisms. He sells Vince. He sells a Vince McMahon character. He puts you in there thinking that you're actually talking to Vince. And one of the biggest things that he brings up, he's like, "Pow," there's all these things, which makes me believe that more Cornette had something to do with it. And it could have been a quick idea that Cornette passed on to. He could have just said it, and it could have been passed on to all these other guys that maybe Vince felt that this was probably the thing to do, but really wanted to get a feeler on how this type of action in this business would be looked at. Like, how would Vince McMahon and the WWF be looked at when this happens? And they maybe wanted different ideas from other people. And then as time has gone on, if you tell yourself something over and over again, you start to believe into your own bullshit at some point, which is, I believe, what Vince Russo did. And maybe Pritchard did, because Pritchard at some point said that, he didn't even know that this happened, but yet at some point he says that my story is the best story because it's the most real story. It's the most entertaining, but it's the most realistic story, and that he even has taken credit for it. So I think everybody wants to take credit for it because it's so infamous, and it is probably one of the ugliest things that happened to pro wrestling, but yet the most exciting thing to happen to pro wrestling.
And I agree with you on Triple H too. I mean, I think what probably happened is I think Cornette probably pitches this to Vince, and then Vince probably grabs Shawn and Hunter and Vince just wants a yes man to tell him this is okay, and goes, "Hey, do you think we should do this?" And then Hunter was probably like, "Absolutely, boss." At this point in time, um, I don't think there's any. I agree. I don't think there's any chance that kind of little pipsqueak guy that's in trouble, Triple H, just goes, "Hey, maybe we should screw him out of the title," out of nowhere. I just don't. I don't see that. That's a work,
Well,
from Triple H.
here's the thing too. Jim Cornette can say he gave the idea. Vince Russo can say he gave the idea. The ultimate call, though, is one guy.
Yeah,
It's Vince McMahon.
Nothing happens in WWE. Cornette talks about it here. To this day, they run the catering menu by Vince McMahon.
Yeah,
like,
they do.
And I don't know if that's legit.
If it's not legit, it's a heck of a rib.
Right?
It's pretty funny.
Yeah, I mean, and either way, it's a good metaphor for the amount of control that we all know he still has on the company. So let's get into the event. We've got all this build up here. So they, Cornette pitches it. Vince runs it through all of his yes men and whatnot. And they decide they're going to do it now. We have the incident where Bret Hart is like kind of smart to this, where he says, "I thought they were gonna screw me." We have the recorded conversation, which was crazy that they happened to be following him on this day, where he's wearing the wire in Vince's office. Which may be one of the only candid recordings of Vince McMahon that exists. Because as we know, anytime he's in the public eye, he's in character, for the most part. So we've got that.
XFL.
Right. Yeah. Rest in peace ×2. Which by the time this airs, that'll be old news, but I'll take it. So he's talking to Hebner. He upgrades Earl Hebner's seat on the plane, and he basically tells Hebner that he thinks something is going on and that they're going to try to use him to screw him over. And Hebner, just kind of like tears up, and he's like, "Man, I would never do that to you." And we've talked a lot about some of the speakers on here having agendas. Do you guys believe Hebner's story here, that he kind of wasn't in on it until right before the match, and then they immediately came up to him and said, "If you want a job, you'll do this"?
Yes, I do. I really do, because I don't think that. I mean, he might have known beforehand, like that's probably why he broke down, in front of Bret, saying I would never let them do that. But I think Bret even says it best. Like, he doesn't even blame Hebner, really, because it's like, I mean, okay, if he did know, what is he supposed to do in that instance? You know, like what would you do if you were in his position? Hey, does Bret Hart sign your paychecks? No, Vince McMahon does. And if he's telling you to do something, you know, you do it. But that's just like it is in any job, you know. So, but do I think that they could have, you know, threatened him like that? Yes, I do. I definitely do. Could he have known beforehand? Maybe, but they didn't even know beforehand, you know, kind of thing. They were still even mulling the idea. Like, I mean, you see it on the day of. Vince McMahon is still trying to come to a resolution on it before he has to do it. So I think he might have been tipped off that, like, hey, we might need you to do something and you might not feel comfortable with it. But
Right.
you know,
And
Or in the aspect of this that Earl's been around the business for a long time. I mean, his brother was a referee. His son would later on be a referee for WWF as well. And so the Hebner family's been around the business for a while. And I think leading up to some of this, people talk. I mean, I think one of the most trusted people in the business are the referees. People, you get one, you fall in love with them, and you know that this guy or gal is going to protect you in the ring. And because as you get smarter into wrestling and you start thinking more and more about it, you start to realize that every piece of the puzzle means something. And so, being a referee and going to shows and having people, ask for me, 100%, like, hey, I want you to do my match, or a booker or promoter saying, hey, you're going to be the main event guy, or you're doing this match because we don't trust anybody else. We know your level of professionalism. I think maybe Earl going up into this, because this seems like this was not a hush hush conversation of what is going to happen with Brett. Is Brett going to leave the WWE, WWF to WCW? Is he going to stay? Now, nobody knew, but this was definitely somebody was talking about this at catering on a weekly basis. So maybe Earl smartened up and was just thinking, I don't know what's going to happen. Nobody's told me the finish. And maybe because Earl was there for so long and was probably the most respected guy in the business as a referee, I think maybe the referees may have known a little bit more than what people think they know, and may have known some direction of the company. Just because a lot of times we're really good about being quiet and not being seen. So maybe that's the reason why Earl got a little upset about it, or maybe he's just upset in general, thinking that this is what the business has gotten to. Maybe he respected the business just as much as Brett did. Nobody knows. I firmly believe that Earl knew it. He knew something. He may have known exactly what was going to happen prior to the match. He may not have known. They may have told him, this is what you're doing. They may have just said, hey, look, you know what we're in. It's going to be handled out there. Just do your job. And he may have questioned and said, exactly, what is doing my job be? Don't worry about it. You know what you're supposed to do. Who's your loyalty lie? Does it lie to Vince McMahon, the WWF, or is Brett going to take you to WCW with him and pay you? So that may have been, the deal. I believe Earl Hebner, and even as a fan, I'm one of the guys that yelled at him how he screwed Brett. Every show that I saw him on, even up to the point where they were in TNA, yep. When he came through, I would scream at him for that, because I really didn't look at it from that perspective. I mean, as an entertainment, funny perspective, I thought it was funny and cool to yell at him. I really didn't take into consideration the amount of weight that man had been walking around with. And until I became a referee and saw the relationships that you build with the talent and how trusting these talents are with you, because you are more than a guy who just pins and does, yell, ring the bell. You're there to be the guy who's watching and making sure that these guys are protecting each other, and you're there as a barrier from the fans. That sometimes, you do a lot of work as a referee that most people don't take into consideration. Now, all of us have had conversations, and we've seen different perspectives of the business, so we kind of know a little bit more about that. But I think Earl took it really personal when he was asked or even told to pick a side, and to know that what was fixing to happen wasn't right. That there probably was a different way to handle this, but when you have this many egos and such a high level, and especially in the entertainment industry, things don't really work out in compromises.
Now, Chris, do you think that this incident was kind of the catalyst for seeing kind of referees kind of get their like a gimmick because as you mentioned like before this point like a referee was kind of always in the background and WWE has gone back to that now where they don't even use referee names but after this happened you had Earl Hebner was this kind of legendary most famous referee in the world at this point because of this incident and then you had like Mike Chioda, Nick Patrick in WCW had this
Randy
kind of
Anderson.
complete aura about him. Charles Robinson legitimately had a gimmick with Lil Nate. Was this event kind of the kickoff for that happening over the next decade or so?
I don't think so. I think that back in the old NWA days with Tommy Young and his infamous slide, even with Tiger Tori and I probably butchered his last name. I'm sorry if I did. But even in New Japan, there's always a standout in major promotions of who the referees were, and it wasn't because of necessarily I think of how good they were. It was the fact that they were seen all the time and then you saw them a lot of the times in the big matches. So you got very familiar with them. And at the time, there wasn't. I mean, WWE probably has 20 referees right now between Monday Night Raw, SmackDown, and NXT, and the guys that they're bringing up. So there wasn't as many referees floating around. I mean, we pretty much can name all the referees that were in WCW at one time. And you could pretty much do the same thing for WWF at the time, So I think it may have brought more attention, but I necessarily don't believe that it made it any. I mean, I think they were all kind of already out there as it is. Excuse me. I think maybe in the 80s, from a WWF perspective, the referees were kind of looked at weird because the territories that they ran up north were more sport based, commissioned. Which is why we end up seeing later on in the years where Vince would come out and say that he was a sports entertainment instead of actual sports. I think it brought a lot of attention to Earl Hebner, and that's about it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that's an incredible perspective on all of that. Let's get into the actual event here where it actually goes down. Survivor Series '97. Um, and as we all know, probably one of the most famous events in wrestling history. The match goes on. Shawn locks in the sharpshooter, which he didn't know how to properly do, which was funny to me. And then, Vince calls for the bell, and even before he doesn't even give Hebner the chance to do what Vince is looking at as the right thing here, and he's saying, ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the bell before Hebner even calls for it. Which, if you've ever had anything to do with running a wrestling show, that's a huge no-no right off the bat. Is you don't ring the damn bell, the referee hasn't called for it. Um, and so Hebner, calls the submission. Brett immediately, reverses it to show like, hey, I wasn't submitting. He does the famous WCW in there, and spits the big loogie on Vince. Um, you know, this event was, I definitely I didn't watch WWF at all until like 2000 2001. I was a WCW guy. Everything I knew about Bret Hart, I knew from his WCW run until I went back and looked at everything. Um, what what is this? wh- if you heard about this as a fan in the time of at the time of '97, what did you think about it? We'll start with you, Caleb.
Well, I didn't even know that it happened because again, that was at the time where '97 was NWO versus Sting for me.
Right.
You know,
Same.
that was that was the greatest storyline, I've ever seen in my life, next to Austin versus McMahon and stuff like that. So I didn't even really know that that's why Bret Hart was coming over to WCW. I just knew that he was coming over to WCW because my dad was just like, yeah, it's been confirmed that Bret's coming over to WCW and stuff like that. But it's funny because I go back to what I said in the beginning of this. If you just, if you heard about this, you would just kind of be like, wait, what? Like, it almost doesn't make sense if you think about it. Like, if you're just watching it and you have no idea about the behind the scenes stuff, which I didn't know about at the time because I was, just a kid. I look at it and I would be like, wait, what? That doesn't make any sense to me. Like, it just, and what sucks about it is if you go and you watch the match back, the matchup that they had or that they were having was awesome. Like, I mean, they were battling out in front of the crowd. You hear Bret, talking about laying the match out and stuff like that, like how he wanted to battle before the match even began and stuff like that. Like, Bret was so good at seeing the bigger picture of a match, better than anyone. I think that's pretty much why like him and Austin's matchup is so, iconic at this point. And it just it sucks because you go and you watch it and the match is awesome. And then you watch like the actual pay-per-view feed that they had and stuff like that. And you don't really see Bret do any of the WCW stuff. You just see Shawn walk away and then they go to black basically. So I didn't know that any of that like really happened. And again, I look at it and it almost just doesn't make sense to me still. Like, I'm just like, I don't get it. Like, because here's my question. Why didn't anyone just say, hey, Vince, you're the boss. Why don't you just take the damn thing away from him? Like, I don't, and I'm sure, you guys can put more perspective on that. But to me, I'm just like, if Vince, makes the whole call, then why didn't he just, go, okay, well, Bret, here, hand me that belt. Thank you. It's mine.
Well,
Kind of.
you want, right? You want him to put your guy over on the way out. And that was the
Right.
thing is like you want Shawn Michaels to be, if he's your guy, you want him to be the solidified, undeniable, just he is the guy. So you want Bret to do the job for him on the way out, and that's what they
Right.
were looking for.
And then, to that point, we're making Shawn Michaels the guy kind of thing. But my thing is if you think about it, Shawn Michaels was only getting the belt temporarily to make Austin the guy.
Right.
Well, Michaels was on his way out when he was getting ready to build Austin up and move him on due to the back injury that he had from when he wrestled Taker and then the infamous back body drop to the casket that really jacked him up.
Right.
So to get to the perspective of your question of why Vince just didn't take the belt from him, at this time we see Vince outside, but he's still not Vince. He's still not Miss McMahon. So at this time, I'm probably like 11, 12 years old. I know a little bit about the business from the back because there's a guy in Charleston, South Carolina that's writing reports about this stuff in the paper. And my cousins would call me up and pass this information along for me. So I didn't know exactly what happened when it happened. I had to be told this from, this is pre-dirt sheet era where anybody and everybody can get it. You could log into AOL.com and message some people every now and then, but for the reality of it, what information wasn't as easy to get. So you're watching this, and I go back and I did not watch it live, so I watched it as a kid or as a teenager, and I look at it and go like, why is Vince running around? Like, he's the guy who's usually behind, over there commentating or whatnot. And my dad tells me like, he owns it. He just don't tell anybody. His dad on it. He gives me the backstory on it. So not a lot of people were familiar on who exactly Vince McMahon was because they just were used to seeing him as a commentator. So seeing Vince do that. One I want to talk about specifically with this docuseries and the footage that they'd used. So we talk about the big loogie that gets spit on Vince, and Scott Hall comes in and says, "This is a work. Here's a piece of evidence that why would the camera team zoom in directly on Vince?" So let's also go this. As soon as I got done watching the documentary today, I rewatched it because it's been a while since I've seen it. Immediately on YouTube follows the whole build-up package of, Shawn Michaels and Bret. And it shows everything from, this is one of the first times we see them walk out from backstage, even a Goldberg-style entrance for both wrestlers. And this is the first time we actually see this. We don't get to see them walk through a gorilla at this point, but we get to see a little bit of backstage. And then the match goes on, and it cuts out, like you said, Shawn walking away. By then, at that point, the loogie had already been spit. But guess what? The WWF product did not show any of that.
Yeah, they didn't.
The footage that's used is from the documentary that was produced, Wrestling with Shadows. So a lot of the footage that we have from this episode is from something else that WWF has. So that, this whole thing that it was a work, this was set up, why did they do this, why did they do that? That would also say that everybody in the business knew that Bret was going to get screwed over. And even the camera guys knew it. And the guys in the production truck knew it. I don't believe that. I believe it happened with a small group of people. I believe that there were phone calls, as some of the other documentaries talk about, where guys were getting called up in the middle of the night leading up to this in hotel rooms and being discussed, the information back and forth. It looks really sad. This shows that Shawn Michaels was not as good as everybody says he was, because the sharpshooter was part of the match. Bret has gone on record and saying that the whole point of the match, he was going to do the sharpshooter, he was going to reverse it, and then they were going to go from there. So that's why we see Bret Hart try to reverse it, because he's showing life still, as you talked about. And Hebner rings a bell and gets out of town. He talks about that. And Cornette says, "I was right in front of him, walking out. I think Earl was right behind me, because they all said, oh, shit. Like, he actually did it. Vince McMahon actually pulled the rug out from underneath Bret Hart. This is going to be some big news. And also some people are going to be pretty pissed off, and we're going to fight about this. But I don't want to be here because I don't want to have anything to do with it, because I didn't make the shot. I gave the idea maybe, but I didn't make that decision." So I think that, Bret Hart looked at it and this is my perspective because I've been in this position before. You're being told you're the guy. You hold the belt. The belt is a object that just says, "Hey, we think that you can put the butts in the seats. Every 18 inches, we think you can fill it in." That's the title. It's your little hat that you would wear that says, I'm the big dog around here. So I think Bret took that very, very seriously, because he understood that what he did, the reactions that he would get fed hundreds of people that worked for WWF. He was carrying it. And he thought that Shawn Michaels was a very disrespectful little shit. And something that a lot of people don't know about or don't pay attention to is that in the WrestleMania match, Bret has gone on to say that when he handed over the belt to Shawn Michaels pretty much told him, "Get the F out of my ring." And it's a huge sign of disrespect, which in this documentary, we see that where he goes and tells him, "You know what? I understand. We don't like each other. We know that if you give me a receipt, I'm going to give you a receipt. But I'm going to tell you now that I'm willing to let all this crap go, and let's put on good matches. Let's take care of ourselves. Let's make some money." And Shawn Michaels said, "Screw you. I'm going to do whatever I want to do," because he was immature and he was on his rampage of doing drugs and alcohol and being, the boy toy. So I think at every moment, Bret Hart was trying to be somewhat professional. There, obviously, I lean a little bit more towards Bret than I do Shawn. But if we just look at it this perspective, we've seen this happen most recently over the last 5-6 years, where Jericho was in, I believe it was Brazil, and he did something to the flag, and that's like a felony down there.
Yeah.
But we look at Shawn Michaels and how many countless times have we seen Shawn Michaels extremely disrespect the Canadian flag. If we did that to the American flag, people would be crazy. I mean, you would have people wanting to kill Bret Hart if he did that. But Bret Hart didn't do that. Shawn Michaels is in Canada. He's in Montreal. He grabs the flag from a fan, gets hit immediately with the soda or a beer, goes in the ring, picks his nose with it, blows his nose, does a little towel dance with it, shoves it down his trunks and pulls it out. Completely disrespectful to the Canadian fans, to the Canadian flag, to everything about Canadians, which Bret Hart, being a Canadian, and like I said, up there, being a Canadian means a big deal in certain territories up there. And you look at Montreal, it's a huge, huge territory where being Canadian is a legitimate thing, and they look at it. So Bret Hart, took that very seriously. And so in that case, Bret Hart said, look, I don't mind dropping the belt to the guy, but he's disrespectful. I don't think he earned it. I earned it. I did everything you told me to do. I grabbed the brass rings that WWE likes to put out. But what brass rings did Shawn Michaels do? Except for disrespect the talent, which Vince didn't look at that. Vince saw dollar signs. Vince saw maybe a different direction that they could go. Maybe Vince Russo's in there pumping them up, saying, hey, man, Turner can't do this, but we can do this. Maybe this is the direction we need to go once we get the belt off of Mr. Clean over there, who's Bret Hart, who's going to play everything by the book, who's not going to curse, who's not going to, go outside of being Clark Kent and Superman. So that's where I really did not like Shawn Michaels as a fan. And as a guy who would run business, if I was a promoter and I had to deal with a guy like Shawn Michaels, I would, you know what, you're here for a couple months and then you're getting the hell out. Once your contract's done, I can't deal with this. Just because it seemed like a nightmare, because you never know what you were going to get until it came to Attitude Era and we got a crap ton of money off of him. But he ran the show and he pissed off a lot of people. So there's no telling how many stars that WWF could have made even bigger, besides the Triple H, besides The Rock, besides the Stone Cold Steve Austin, which, let's be honest, once any of these guys were given a platform to do anything, they were going to be stars regardless because of the amount of work that they were going to put into the business. So I just think that Shawn Michaels could have done something differently. I think Vince could have done something differently. Could Bret have done something differently? Yeah, maybe he should have agreed to drop the belt somewhere else a lot sooner. But I don't think Bret was in that mentality. I think Bret was really thinking that this company was going to take care of him because in his mind, he'd been taking care of everybody for so long.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that too. And, a lot of people prefer Sean's second run, and I'm one of those people over, his first run, because he was down to do business and he was, sober Sean, had found the smile. I got the smile back, and you know, um, we're running pretty long here. So the one last thing I want to cover before we wrap it up is kind of you mentioned Scott Hall's comments here. I personally think he is completely full of shit. There's no way that he hasn't talked to Sean about this 100 times. But let's explore it. Is it possible that this was a work? And if it is, I mean, if it is, if this was a work, it would be one of the greatest works of all time, and it's been protected by the people involved literally forever. I don't personally believe it is, but I want to hear what you guys think about Scott Hall's comments here. Caleb, what did you think about it?
Well, because like I said, from the beginning, I can see where people would question it as a work because I mean, everything in pro wrestling is a work, basically. let's just be honest. But and especially when we hear all the time, what is the one thing that we always hear from the WWE is that there's one guy in charge, Vince McMahon. And I just, to me, at times I still even look at it. I'm just like, okay, again, why didn't he just, say, here, give me my belt. All right, cool. I'll figure out some other way to write you off. He's had no problems doing that in the past or something like that. But at the same time, I can see everyone's perspective in it. Like I can see where Bret Hart gets pissed off that, you know, a lot of this stuff is happening to him, especially when, you know, we talk about good storylines. I thought one of the more forgotten storylines that was really, really good was the Hart Foundation. Like the Hart with Bret Hart, Davey Boy Smith, Owen Hart, Brian Pillman, and you had Jim the Anvil Neidhart. I mean, because, you know, they did the whole anti-America thing, but it was different because they would go to Canada and you would hear this loud reaction like Stone Cold was in the building, you know, kind of thing. Like you'd never heard a reaction like that, you know. I go to Calgary Stampede, In Your House Calgary Stampede. That's one of the coolest things I've ever seen. I'm just like, wow, and it was real. You know, it was legit. It wasn't telling the fans that, no, you have to boo this guy or you have to cheer for him. No, they were going to cheer for him regardless. But I mean, I definitely don't. I definitely think that Scott Hall's full of shit when he's like, "Yeah, I haven't talked to Sean about this." Yeah, okay. You only talk every single day, so so that's a lie right there. Do I? Again, I agree that there's ways that they could have handled this. They could have done it right. In fact, you know, Cornette lays it out. He's like, yeah, you know, it should be a happy ending. You know, Bret Hart, you know, he would have handed the belt over to Shawn. Shawn would have gone over, and Bret would have left, and we'd have all, you know, just it had just been another night. But instead, it became this, you know, it became this thing that was responsible for so many things happening. It was responsible for the Attitude Era kickoff, and it was responsible for Vince McMahon finally realizing, okay, I've got some money in me being a heel. Now I just need the perfect dance partner. And he found it with Stone Cold Steve Austin. And when, you know, you finally got the two of those together, that was just, well, the WWE could just print money, basically. But I understand why Bret wouldn't want to drop the belt to Shawn because, you know, if when I was doing or when I was training to do some wrestling and stuff like that, you know, one of the things I remember there was this guy who came in and all he knew was karate, and he never like tried to like. He would always be like, well, you know, when I get him over in the arm breaker, can I turn it into a bicep slicer or something like that? And I said, you slice my bicep and I'm going to, you know, poke your eyes out kind of thing, you know? So I can see why Bret gets pissed at him for that, because that is very disrespectful. And we paint this, you know, bad picture of Shawn Michaels then because that, I mean, you know, he was a prick. He's even said that though himself. He's like, yeah, I was messed up. I was in a dark place, you know, and you know, he's very remorseful of that. And I'm glad that he changed his life around. He found God. He, you know, he's living this great life right now, you know. I think that's where Bret kind of even gets more bitter because after that, you know, Bret really what he should have had was he should have had this rocket run in WCW when he went there after this. Like they should have capitalized on this, and you know they should have let him come out and say whatever was on his mind. You know, he's saying, yeah, I broke my, you know, fist, but I broke it because I punched Vince McMahon out and stuff like that. And they should have done all of this, but they didn't. And, you know, his life really took a bad turn. You know, he did the horrible deal with WCW. And then, you know, his brother dies from a freak accident, which we will unfortunately have to cover here because they made a Dark Side of the Ring on that one. And, you know, he had a stroke. So, you know, it in WWE's version, they paint Michaels as this like sacrificial lamb, and then like, oh, he rose though from the ashes. But then, you know, Bret, it's like, well, poor Bret, you know, he kind of faded into obscurity because of it. You know, there could have been different ways that they could have handled this, but ultimately, had it not gone down this way, then, you know, we would not be sitting here talking about this episode. And I don't, and again, you know, just because of the curtain call, even, I don't think we would have seen an attitude era. I don't think we would have seen a Mr. McMahon, heel turn or anything, because Vince didn't even want to go in front of the camera. He wanted to, stay out of that. But then after that, he had no choice basically. And so, I mean, I can see where people say it's a work because, again, I think the idea of it, if you really think about it, is a little ridiculous. But at the same time, I can also, I'm just kind of like, yeah, but I don't think I don't think people would have gone to great lengths to tell the story of it if it was this much of a work. They'd have been like, yeah, it was a work.
And to keep it for this long.
Yeah, exactly.
Chris, what's your kind of, thoughts on this being a work and kind of your final thoughts on the whole episode?
Yeah. So we go out, if we look outside the episode and really just kind of touch base with people who have called it a work, one of the most infamous people that call it a work all the time is Honky Tonk Man, who is notorious for going on anybody and everybody's shoot interview. So I think a lot of the times information that Honky Tonk Man, if you're going to take it as information, it's going to be like listening to Iron Sheik for information. You're getting you're turned left and right. If you're looking for some of these shoot interviews as entertainment purposes, I think you're going to find that value in it. But to be credible witnesses to this stuff, I don't believe it. I think over time, this story has become a wise tale and is as big as Paul Bunyan. And so I think everybody and their grandmother wants to talk about how they were involved in it and how they created it and took credit for it, and may even just say, hey, you know what, now it's a work because it's been told by so many different people and there's nobody can get a straight story. The reality of it is that there's only a handful of people that probably know the legitimacy behind this story. Vince McMahon, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels. I'm going to barely say Triple H because he probably heard a sliver of it while he was hanging out with Shawn Michaels, carrying Shawn Michaels' bags at the times, because it's about the only thing he was allowed to do at that point in time. I would believe Cornette, because he's one of the few people that Vince trusted in many different areas. I mean, he ran OVW for so long. He was part of Smoky Mountain for such a long time. He went into ECW. So if you look at one thing overall, Cornette has his hand in everything. So if there's going to be a work, Cornette's going to be the one working us. But a lot of the information that he spews out has lined up with everybody else. And he is one of the few people, along with Bret Hart, that the story has not changed. This is where I say that I don't believe it's a work. Because when you work somebody, you have a goal in mind. The same thing with the Brawl for All. They took the Brawl for All idea as this idiot's going to come out with this shoot thing, and Vince is buying into it because he wants, ratings. He wants whatever he's trying to get. He's looking at the brighter side of it, and he's trying to make a buck. And he's like, this is different. We're going to go with it. And so I think at this point in time, nobody won with the Brawl for All. They tried to make it a work, and it didn't work out because the black sheep came in and knocked him out. And he was the black horse. Spark Gun came in, knocked out, changed things up. Look at this. If it was a work, who's going to win? Nobody. Because the Vince McMahon character did come out of this, but I don't think it came out in the way that he would expect it to be, and they went with that. Shawn Michaels didn't win out of it. His run was as good as his mustache that I'm growing. It was terrible because the ratings dropped with him. Bret Hart didn't win anything out of it except for a guaranteed contract. And once again, his run in WCW, as you said, was as good as this mustache because they didn't know how to do it. Just as like I don't know how to grow a good mustache. And you got to be crazy to think that I wasn't going to sit here and talk about it at least once. And I'm talking about the mustache.
I like the stash. I love it. I like the stash.
But it didn't do anything for anybody. It did absolutely nothing. We saw Bret Hart. He didn't show up to Monday Night Nitro for at least a month. And when he did come in, there was no setup for him. So you had a month from the time that he left WWF to do something with him, to figure out what you're going to do. And your best idea is to bring him in as a guest referee in a Goldberg match. It just didn't work
Larry
out.
Zbyszko versus Eric Bischoff.
Was okay. So according to the documentary that we watched, the clip they showed right afterwards was
Right.
the match with Goldberg, and I forget who was it, Hogan that he worked in, but it was the infamous steel plate part. So thanks for correcting me. But still, in that aspect, how many times? So that's more than once that they used him as an enforcer, or as a guest referee. When one of the best matches that he had was probably with Booker T or Chris Benoit in the tribute show for Owen Hart. And I tell you, to this point in time, if it was such a work, why is there so much guilt from Bret Hart leaving WWF and not taking anybody with him, or not saying, hey, you know what, I'll sacrifice myself and just stay with WWF? Because he has enormous amount of guilt of not taking Owen with him. He has enormous amount of guilt of not taking Davey Boy with him, or Anvil. Look at how many people from the Hart Foundation that are still alive today. None of them. And there's only one, Bret Hart, and he left to go to WCW. And from that time frame, all those guys went in and out of WCW and WWF, and none of them are here because they weren't treated right, they weren't used right, and they went off the deep end just as many other wrestlers do. I just don't believe that it was a work. It's really hard for me to do that, because when you have a work, you have a winner and you have a loser, and somebody's getting a payday and somebody's not. And I just don't see anybody getting put over from this.
And I think the creation of that on-screen Vince McMahon character probably led to a lot of the negative opinions about him. Not that those aren't valid, that exist today. Right. Because without that, I mean, he would have probably remained kind of behind the scenes and been even more elusive than he is. But I think we've covered this one pretty in depth. Chris, absolutely, thank you for joining us here today. You can see Chris on when wrestling starts back up. We're still kind of in quarantine here. You can see him on Palmetto Championship Wrestling. You can see him on Viral Pro Wrestling. Absolutely, thanks for joining us today, Chris.
Hey guys, thanks for giving me something to do other than what's going on in the world. I appreciate you guys coming out and doing what you guys doing, giving people an opportunity to think about something other than life right now. Right. And like I said, hey, out of everything that's happening in this world, there's one thing that we can take away from coronavirus, and that we know that no matter what happens, professional wrestling is alive, and it's the one true sport in the world. Whether you want to believe it or not, it's the most entertaining thing on television. And if you don't believe me, you go check the ratings, because the only thing higher right now is the people tuning in to get info about the coronavirus. Pro wrestling is going to live no matter what happens.
And speaking of watching wrestling content, I also want to thank, as always, my co-host, the man who watches more wrestling than anybody I know. You can hear him on the Stovall Wrestling Network, and I believe you guys just put out a brand new episode. Is that right?
Yes, we did. I have Jay Garganis and Bill Blanchard on there. And then we'll have one. It's every Tuesday. Every Tuesday now will be a brand new episode of the Stovall Wrestling Network. And you can also hear me commentate for VPW, Viral Pro Wrestling.
Well, thanks, gentlemen, and thanks, everybody, for tuning in and watching, especially if you're still with us. This is probably our longest episode to date. But I knew it was going to go that way. But thanks for tuning in, guys. This has been an Evolved Review.